Hello, everyone. Today is March 11th, 2020, and we are going to be reflecting on Luke 16, 19 through 31, some reflections that came from the prayer of recollection. So I'm going to read that. Here we go. Jesus said, "There was a certain rich man who was splendidly clothed in purple and fine linen, and who lived each day in luxury. At his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, who was covered with sores. As Lazarus lay there longing for scraps from the rich man's table, the dogs would come and lick his open sores. Finally, the poor man died and was carried by the angels to sit beside Abraham at the heavenly banquet. The rich man also died and was buried, and he went to the place of the dead. There, in torment, he saw Abraham in the far distance with Lazarus at his side. The rich man shouted, 'Father Abraham, have some pity! Send Lazarus over here to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue. I'm in anguish in these.' But Abraham said to him, 'Son, remember that during your lifetime you had everything you wanted, and Lazarus had nothing. So now he is here being comforted, and you are in anguish. And besides, there's a great chasm separating us. No one can cross over to you from here, and no one can cross over to us from there.' Then the rich man said, 'Please, Father Abraham, at least send him to my father's home, for I have 5 brothers, and I want to warn them so that they won't end up in this place of torment.' But Abraham said, 'Moses and the prophets have warned them. Your brothers can read what they wrote.' The rich man replied, 'No, Father Abraham, but if someone is sent to them from the dead, then they will repent of their sins and turn to God.' But Abraham said, 'If they won't listen to Moses and the prophets, they won't be persuaded, even if someone rises from the dead.'" So let's look a little bit here at the first few verses. I think this is interesting artistically. He says that the rich man was splendidly clothed in purple and fine linen. And I feel like he's comparing that because right after that he says that Lazarus was covered with sores. So comparing how their bodies were covered or clothed. And then it says that the rich man lived each day in luxury, while Lazarus lay longing for scraps from the rich man's table, and the dogs would come and lick his open sores. So I think that's an interesting way to contrast that. Now, moving into the rest of this story that Jesus is telling, this is kind of mind-blowing. Like, I have no idea how much of this is literary and artistic, and how much of this is actually what it's going to be like when we die. You know, do the angels come and carry those who have lived with God right up to the heavenly banquet right away, whereas the dead people go right to a place of torment? Can they really see us? And can they see the people who love God? And can they speak to them? So that's a little mind-blowing. I have no idea. If you have any thoughts on that, I would love to hear them. I do think this is very interesting. He says what the rich man longs for is for Lazarus to come comfort him. He says, "Please send him, Lazarus, to put the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue. I'm in anguish in these flames." Well, isn't that kind of ironic? He doesn't, I think, you know, that the person he asks for to be sent is Lazarus. And I feel like that Jesus is saying in this story, "I sent you Lazarus." And I think there's also an analogy of how Lazarus was longing for the scraps from his table, and the rich man is now longing just for a drip of water on his tongue from Lazarus's finger. That what he wants from Lazarus is like as small as what Lazarus wanted from him, but he didn't give him that. Well, actually, we don't know. It doesn't say whether he let Lazarus have the scraps from the table. But I do think that there's some literary irony that is being pulled in there to emphasize this point with the rich man. And then I feel like that this is that at first it struck me as like that almost feels vindictive, that it says, you know, during your lifetime you had everything you wanted and Lazarus had nothing. So now he is being here comforted and you are in anguish, kind of like almost sounding like if you have a hard life and you have torment and anguish in this life, that you'll have a good life later, and vice versa. But I don't think that that's what he's saying. I think what he's pointing out here is that the rich man had the opportunity to do something about Lazarus. If he had cared about bigger things than himself, if he had been in the true heart of God, who lavishes love and goodness on us, he would have shown kindness to Lazarus when he had the chance. And that's the other thing that I think is interesting about that. It definitely has the feel to me in this story of the when you have the chance, that this is our life to examine the evidence, to make our choice, and to live out the way that God is calling us to live, like himself, to let him transform us into that. When this life is over, those things are gone. The evidence, the time for examining the evidence and making the choice and making the hard commitments is gone. Now it feels like there's this great chasm that separates God and the people who chose him from those who did not. And I wonder if that chasm represents where God's goodness stops. That in this life, it's all intermingled. There is no chasm. The goodness and the badness and all the choice and the evidence and all of that feels confusing and intermingled, and we've got a lot of sorting and through and thinking and choosing to do. But in the next life, God's goodness, this is how I'm imagining this from this verse, will be contained and focused, pure. It will be completely pure. It won't be diluted and intermingled with evil and badness. And then there will be a chasm, and then I'm like drawing this out on the surface below me with my hands. You can't see that, but I can. There will be a chasm then where on the other side there is none of God's goodness. And that's why there is the anguish, is that these people in this place are separated from the only source of true and complete goodness. And outside of that, there is nothing good, only pain. And I think it's also interesting that I feel like the story continues in the irony when the rich man says, well, then send Lazarus to my brothers, to my father's home, so he can speak to my brothers. Again, I feel like the answer is, we sent Lazarus to your home. He was there. And when they had the chance that they could make that choice. And, going down a little further, it says, where it goes to but if someone is sent to them from the dead, then they will repent of their sins and turn to God. But Abraham said, if they won't listen to Moses and the prophets, they won't be persuaded even if someone rises from the dead. I think that this part is saying that the problem here was not that they didn't have enough evidence. The problem was with their hearts. They had all the evidence that they needed to make their right choice and to see what was real in the writings of Moses and the prophets. And I think that we think that too sometimes today too. I mean, it wasn't even that long ago that I had someone tell me, I wish that God would just send me a sign. And I think he's saying here, you have all of the signs and the evidence that you need to make your right choice. And so the issue really becomes a heart issue. And then finally, I just love the way that Jesus ended this story when he said, the way he sets it up, and then he comes in and says, even if someone rises from the dead, they won't be persuaded. Because at the time that they heard this, that probably wouldn't have felt very meaningful to them. I mean, it would be an interesting story. It's a very interesting story. But that ending, now imagine, roll the clock forward, and imagine how that struck them after he rose from the dead. And especially when they saw people not being persuaded, even after he had risen from the dead. Just such a powerful, amazing, Jesus was so brilliant. I praise you, Jesus.